and put a lot of thought into that, because that really is going to differentiate which side of the table people are coming from.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, I think if they're able to answer the yes to the question, are you a fiduciary? The answer is, are you paid to put my interests first? And that way their interests are aligned with your interests. And I think that's the start of a harmonious business relationship. And that also ensures that you get the best advice possible.
Right. And, obviously, good education is something that we all in our industry want to give people. Is we want to educate you on what the ups and downs, ins and outs are of this stuff. And, the more you're educated, the more value we're able to provide you, because then you have some of that information too. Do you believe it's important then, as far as from a personal life standpoint as well as business, that people create some sort of strategy? This is kind of a no-brainer question, but do you feel like people should put something together and maybe stick to it on a weekly basis?
Sure. So, I'll start from the top. I think hope is not a strategy. So, if you say everything's going to be okay and my job's always going to be there, you may be in for a rude awakening. If only because laws change, economics change. Job places change, and life events change. You could become disabled, that type of thing. So I would say that putting some strategy around your life is always a good idea from a long-term perspective. I would say strictly from an estate planning perspective, the idea of making sure you have a will and healthcare proxy and living trust if appropriate, those types of things, that's standard, and you should do it, especially if you have a family. I would also think that the idea of having an investment strategy is a good idea. I think taking some time to figure out where you are currently, what your situation is as it relates to your costs, whether you have any debt, and what your goals are going forward. I think getting that written down and thought about is important, because if you don't write it down and think about it, you have nothing to check against, and you could waste a lot of time, and more importantly, make a lot of poor decisions going forward as to how to invest proceeds, or whether you take one job versus another, or whether you borrow money to do this, that, or the other thing. If you don't have a longer time horizon in mind and a longer framework of goals in mind, then I think you're setting yourself up for a potential problem. As it relates to something that you look at weekly, I think from a budgeting standpoint and just understanding what you have in your checkbook and how it relates to your expenses and so on, I think that's a weekly or biweekly exercise, monthly at minimum. From an investment standpoint, I guard against people looking at their investments that often, because I would rather have them have a longer term horizon as it relates to their investments. If you're constantly watching CNBC and watching the market go up and down, and is Tesla doing this, that, or the other thing, you can drive yourself crazy. I would much rather have people have a broader, let's call it an investment policy statement, saying this is how I want my proceeds invested. These are the goals for which I'm investing them for. If things start to move in the market, these are the bandwidths upon which I've allocated my assets. If they get too high or too low, I can have them shifted a little bit or adjusted accordingly. I would look at investments for most people. Quarterly would probably be a good look. For those people who are really busy, I think even annually is fine. But if people feel like they really have to be on top of it, I think quarterly is not a problem. And that instills two things. Number one, a little bit of discipline around the structure you've built around your wealth and the investment policy statement. And two, it gets you away from the short-termism and day trading mentality that I think is not very productive for most people.
Yeah, and it can be dangerous, especially if you don't know what you're doing, obviously.
It's dangerous. Dangerous even if you do know what you're doing.
That's true. Very true. Very true. Now, this kind of ties in, when I was mentioning individual and business, is this sounds very much like having a business plan for your family, really. It's like having that roadmap to know, not only what you're doing today and next week, but 5 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out, is giving yourself a plan that you know ahead of time where you're headed, so that you're not having to change direction as frequently. You sort of know where the ultimate destination is. And so you're able to make course corrections, but not on a very constant basis.
Right. I completely agree with that. It is a business plan. I think that one of the areas I would think about too is some people chafe when I talk about 1 year, 5 year, 10 years out. And instead they like the idea of framing the timeframes around certain events. And so things like marriages of kids,
right.
College costs, retirement, and then ultimately death and what you're going to do with those assets afterward. To try to chart around that, I think, is another way to do it if you're not comfortable with 5, 10, 15 years. And the nice thing too is that if circumstances change, if there's an untimely death or if there's a divorce or something like that, you can do what you described, course correct and
Sure.
reevaluate what your new issues are. And I think that's the key. I think having a broader structure upon which you go, it helps solve a bunch of different mistakes. And then if something comes up that you didn't plan for, which is inevitable with life, then you're able to deal with it without too much carnage to your personal financial situation.
Yeah, and I love what you point out, correlating it to life events, because that really, for our listeners, is a huge gold nugget of how to strategize. Is looking at it, in a very real life term. It's looking at it, with the emotion involved, because really you're going to be looking at it that way. You're not looking at it in a very impersonal manner. You're looking at it as like you mentioned, Frazer, when your kids get married, or when you're wanting to maybe go from the apartment into an actual house, when maybe you want to plan on getting a new car, when you're planning on perhaps retiring from your job, or stepping away part-time from the job. All those different things that happen in life, those are very key points. And by looking at it in those terms, you're really going to be a lot more invested in your plan, because it's that rule by association, you might say, that when you associate your planning to those events, then you're really more invested in it, I think.
No question about it. In the vernacular of our industry, it's called goals-based investing. And a neat little trick is to set up different pools of money for your different goals. You may not be thinking of it in this way, but having a 401k is, in a sense, setting aside a pool of money for retirement. Well, you can do the same types of things, maybe not as tax advantaged, but the same types of things for other different goals. So if you set up an account for the purpose of a house, or you set up an account for the purpose of one of your kids' weddings, or et cetera, on down the line, that gives you something to siphon money into and invest for, and it keeps your goals organized. You can chart how you're progressing through each of those goals, and then if something happens where you have to make a decision to sacrifice one for another, or if you lose your job and things get a little bit difficult, you see where that is, as opposed to having one big pool of money and then all of a sudden you're overwhelmed by what seem like a lot of different demands that may or may not you may not be able to execute.
Right. So as far as specific roadblocks, we'll go from just advising maybe a young business owner for the moment. Certain business or certain roadblocks that you've seen through your experience in having a practice, what would you warn them against, a new business owner?
Well, so for a new business owner, obviously the new business is the be all end all of the new business owner's experience. To get something up and running and to make it profitable, that's where all the all available resources are probably going, and that's where the attention is. So a roadblock in many ways is for people trying to establish a larger financial plan, is to try to get the new business owner to say, look, you've got to think about things a little bit more long term as well. I'm not saying you take any time away from your business, but for first things first, try to plan a little bit for retirement away from the business so that you have some proceeds available for that. I would try to build a safety net of cash to the extent you can. And as a business owner myself now, and as having advised a bunch of them, I know that that's extremely difficult, but I like the idea of having some safe money, some margin for error in case something goes wrong. Frankly, if you're borrowing money from a bank, they're going to want to see that anyway. That's a big component of it. But I think the other roadblock too, from an attention standpoint, is making sure that they have the structure in place for their families and for the other things that they want to do, wills, living trusts, healthcare proxies, making sure that those I's are dotted as well, because life can jump out in front of you and make things a little bit difficult. And if you don't have that in place, then you can leave your loved ones in a lot of chaos, and you could cause yourself a lot of different problems as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's also, especially when you have employees as well, these considerations from a business owner standpoint, we want to employ that on the behalf of our employees. Make sure that they have the tools available so that they can have the will, the complete will package put together, and they can in turn make sure that their I's are dotted and T's crossed with things such as life insurance or disability protections and what have you. And then even from a business owner standpoint, key person protections, because as a business owner, if something happens to one of your key employees, you're going to have to make sure that you fill that seat. And so that's going to have a financial ramification on your business, and certainly something that you want to address ahead of time rather than later, because if you do it first, then you don't have to reach into that bucket of money that we were talking about to rescue you from a mistake.
James, you make a great point there, that the employees are an unbelievably important constituency in your life, and to treat them well and to be thinking about them in those terms has a couple of really nice points to it. The first one is, A, it's the right thing to do. Sure. B, it's very important to treat them well and to keep them happy and to keep them productive and to keep them safe to the extent you can, because ultimately that reputation will garner really well for your business going forward. And number three, to get back to the legacy component we talked about, if you're able to help make other people's dreams work by virtue of them being employed with you, you're having that geometric impact on legacy going forward. And I'm a big believer in karma on that front, and I think those things spill back to you in a really nice way.
They do for sure. And like you said, it's the right thing to do. And when you do those things, word gets out, and you're going to have loyal employees. And a loyal employee is something you cannot put a dollar figure on, because they will stick with you, in the good times and bad, and they will stick it out. And they know that you care about their family and their life. So, look at it that way, because, again, it's the right thing to do.
Well, and doing the right thing too, just to follow up on that, it creates loyal customers as well. Sure. And it also creates loyal vendors. So that other part where you're using other people, when the word gets out that you have a good reputation for how you treat your employees, your vendors will probably be there for you when times get tough. And your customers, if you get to a point where tie goes to the person or the company that they feel better about, they will stick with you, and that's a nice thing.
Oh, absolutely. So, what are some maybe support and resources that a budding entrepreneur should be looking for? Obviously, there's SCORE that's out there for people to reach into, and Small Business Administration. But what are some additional support resources that you've run across that you might want to, open people's eyes to?
Well, the biggest thing I think that's important is to have a circle of like-minded people around you that you can bounce things off of. I talk a little bit about it in my book on the personal level of having a kitchen cabinet or a cabinet of people that aren't your official advisors that you can bounce things off of. And for a lot of entrepreneurs, I think having a group of other entrepreneurs who are going through the same types of issues, I think that's really good to have, because there are times when it's very lonely out there and you don't have the answers, and you've got a bunch of people looking up to you, hoping that you're providing direction. And there are plenty of people in everybody's communities who are starting businesses and going through different flavors of the same thing that you're going through. I would encourage you to go to those types of scenarios at a broader level, and I guess maybe a bigger company level. There's a thing called YPO, which is the Young Presidents Organization, and I believe that's for people who run companies with I forget the number of employees that they have, but let's call it 100. So for some entrepreneurs, that's probably